I built the Airfix de Havilland Vampire in 1/72 scale as one of the first build videos back when I started making YouTube content in 2016. Back then it was considered a starter set. Now however it would only be classed as a gift set, but I wanted to revisit this model and see if it was as good as I remember it being. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and kind of review the Airfix Vampire T.11 but in a custom paint scheme. So in this video today I'm going to be building this kit in a custom paint scheme to replicate a Sea Vampire T.22. Fortunately, the aircraft are basically identical, so I don't need to make any modifications, and I can use the kit in its most basic format. For a more detailed dive inside of the box to take a look at the parts, the decals and instructions, check out my dedicated unboxing video. In this one I'll be focusing on what this kit is like to build. If you have seen my unboxing video though, you'll know that this particular kit was coated in excessive amounts of oil. I presume this is the mould release they've been using in the factory. So the very first step I had to do was give this a wash in warm soapy water to help remove any of this residue. I then left the parts to air dry, and then I could begin the construction. I'll snip the parts away from the sprue using my cutter and sand down any rough areas of plastic with a sanding stick and cut away any small amounts of flash using a knife. Despite the high number of production runs this kit has had, I'm actually surprised by the low amount of flash that was present on the parts. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice during this build, and my first step was to start work on the cockpit areas. I glued the two clear reflector gun sights onto the control panel, then added the control sticks to the cockpit floor. The seats were glued in as well, which was then followed by this rear part of the cockpit. This front bulkhead containing the rudder pedals was included, and then the control panel I just assembled was added into the floor as well. And now it's time to prime. I'm going to be using this K-Colors black primer. This was loaded into my airbrush and then applied to the cockpit assembly, the internal walls of the fuselage and also the crew figures. Once that was dry, I turned my attention to painting the crew. First up, Humbrol 61, which is a matte flesh colour, was used on their faces. Following this, Vallejo Camouflage Olive Green would be used as the main colour for their flight overalls. Vallejo English Uniform would be used to pick out small details such as their gloves. Vallejo White was used to paint their helmets, and you'll notice that I have left some details in the black primer colour. When that was all dry, some Humbrol No. 1 Primer Grey would be dry brushed over the figures to help bring out any raised details. I would also replicate this step on the cockpit assembly as well. With that done, it's time to apply a decal which is included for the control panel. I use some Humbrol Decal Fix to help stick this onto the control panel part, with the transfer having been soaked in warm water previously to release it from the backing paper. A little more decal fix should help soften this into the plastic and stick it down. After this, I glued in the two pilot figures. Technically, this kit does have the ability to be mounted on a display stand. Sadly, no display stand is included, but I do have some old, vintage style stands which I purchased separately. In order to install these, I need to cut a slot in the bottom of each fuselage half. With that done, it will mean I can display this aircraft in a flying pose. Before we can get to that point though, I need to glue in the cockpit. And it is worth pointing out that if you are having the landing gear lowered, you will need to put weight in the nose, just so that it doesn't sit on its tail. But I skipped that because mine is going to be flying. The other half of the fuselage was then joined on, and then I moved on to building up the engine air intake assembly. Once that was done, it was carefully added into the fuselage. This was then followed by installing the jet exhaust pipe in the rear. I could then add the air intakes at the front of the leading edges of the wings, and then with that done, the upper wing surface could be glued on. It is worth assembling the tail booms at this point, and this is a fairly simple process. They come in two halves that get glued together, and then this small stabilizer is added onto the side in the slot. You'll notice that the pitot tube is moulded onto this one, and it is worth taking care not to knock this off, as it is quite fine and delicate. With the two booms assembled, the central tail surface was glued between them, and then the tail booms could be mounted onto the upper wing surface. This was a little fiddly, and I did have to try and take care to ensure that these were as level and square as possible. Following on from this, I glued in the nose wheel gear bay, which also houses the mounts for the 20mm cannons. And because my aircraft is flying, the landing gear cover was glued in the closed position. In the lower wing surfaces, there are a couple of holes that can be drilled out. These allow you to mount external fuel tanks if you'd like to do so. With those holes drilled out, I carefully glued in the lower wing surfaces onto the upper wing surfaces. It is worth noting that there is a tiny little gap at the wing root, but I didn't bother to address it during this particular build. The next step was to glue in place the landing gear covers for the main gear bays, and again, a raised option is provided in the kit. This was then followed by installing the little weight balances for the elevator. The external tanks that I mentioned earlier are fairly simple to construct, comprising of two halves which can be joined together. I won't add them into the model yet though, I'll add them after some painting. I will, however, glue into place the clear canopy parts. The canopy comes in 3 components, and you can display it open if you'd like to do so. In my case though, as the aircraft is flying, it will be completely shut. And with the majority of the build now complete, I spent a little bit of time addressing the seams running along the centre of the fuselage. I should be in a good position to start painting, but before I start painting I need to mask the clear parts. Fortunately, I've received a free sample of the CT scale models mask set for this particular aircraft type. This was received for review purposes and all opinions remain my own. However, I have enjoyed using these masks as they seem to be cut to the perfect sizes for the relevant window panes, and it's a simple matter to peel them from the backing sheet and apply them to the correct windows. The instructions are fairly comprehensive as well, which means you get them in the right places. I particularly like on this set that you do have the option to mask around the windscreen wiper on the front windscreen, which means that this part can be painted at the same time as everything else. The masks don't cover all of the large panes though, so for these gaps I used some Vallejo liquid mask to fill in the areas. This would be applied carefully, allowing it to butt up against the masks so that there were no gaps where paint could get in. I left that to dry, and then it was time to prime once again. The K-Colours black makes a reappearance here, and this was airbrushed over the canopy frame areas. This should help give the impression that these parts have been painted black from the inside if you can view it in such a way. After this, I added some aluminium paint to the landing light on the lower side of one of the wings. A mask is included for this as well, so when that paint was dry, I popped the mask onto this landing light so that it would be protected in the next step. And the next step is another primer, but this is actually going to be one of my main colours. I'm using Tamiya Fine Surface Primer in white. This was sprayed over the entire aircraft and also the external fuel tanks, which I've not yet added. This should give a nice smooth surface for subsequent layers of paint to stick to, but in the particular paint scheme I'm replicating, I do need the lower surfaces to be white, so this is perfect. This will save so much work. When that was dry, I carefully masked the lower surfaces, and I did have to take a little care as this technically has a wraparound camouflage scheme. For the upper surfaces, I'm going to paint this in Vallejo Intermediate Green. It might not be perfectly accurate for the specific paint scheme I'm replicating, but I think it's close enough. This was thinned down with some Tamiya X20A acrylic thinner so it could pass through my airbrush easily. A number of coats of this paint would be evenly applied to all of the upper surfaces and also those lower surfaces where it wraps around. And when that was eventually dry, I carefully removed all the masks, which seemed to have done a pretty good job. In preparation for some transfers, I'm going to clear coat this with some Humbrol clear gloss varnish. This was loaded into my airbrush straight from the bottle and then carefully sprayed over the entire model. And when that was dry, it was time to move on to some transfers. So the kit comes with a paint scheme which is silver for a New Zealand aircraft, but as I've already built that one many years ago, I won't need the majority of these decals. I do, however, need the little stencil ones, so these were cut from the sheet. For my particular paint scheme, however, I've purchased this set of Xtradecals, which contains a variety of different schemes for a number of different aircraft. The decal sheet are manufactured by Microscale and are printed to a really nice quality. And I think there are enough decals on here to perhaps get at least 2 aircraft done without having to purchase additional roundels. I identified the relevant transfers that I needed and removed them from the sheet. The only thing I kind of wish with this sheet was that the relevant decal schemes were all placed together, as it is a bit hunt the decal, but after a little bit of time I did manage to find all the ones I needed. As usual, Micro Set and Sol will be my setting solutions during this build. So the decal application process was to soak these transfers in warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you'd like to get your hands on your own brush water mug, check out my merch store. With the transfers now suitably soaked in water, the areas where they were going to go were painted with some Micro Set from the blue bottle. The decals were then carefully slid off the backing paper and positioned. Additional coats of the setting solutions can help soften the transfers into the surface details and also avoid any silvering. The decal application stage was actually relatively straightforward. I found the kit included stencils maybe to be a little thin and possibly prone to folding up, but they are printed by Cartograph to their normal standard, and with a little care and patience it is possible to get them all in the right places. The Xtradecals I've bought were almost the same quality, and I experienced no problems applying these to the aircraft, and with some repeated applications of Micro Sol from the red bottle, everything settled into the surface really nicely. On the lower surfaces we have these identification codes, and this is the reason why I left these underwing tanks off. I wasn't sure if these tanks would get in the way of the transfers. Better to be safe than sorry. But before I move on to the next step, I glued the underwing tanks into place. And the next step is simply to give everything another clear coat of gloss varnish. This should help seal in the transfers and protect them from the next stages of the build. And the next stage of the build is to apply a tiny amount of weathering. I have this Humbrol 79 blue-grey enamel paint, which I thinned down quite heavily with some white spirit to make a very thin wash. This was then painted over the entire aircraft and allowed to flow into all the recessed details to help add some contrast and shade to the model. I could go further with additional weathering, but I think as a trainer aircraft they probably would be quite well looked after. So when that was dry, the next step was to go over everything with some K-Colours semi-matte varnish. This will dull down that gloss ever so slightly and give a more uniform look to the aircraft. One thing I need to remember to do though is to paint the engine exhaust, and I used some gunmetal paint to do this. This was done carefully by hand, trying to make sure I don't ruin any of the paintwork I've previously applied. And then with that done, it was time to start removing the masks. The landing light mask was removed from the lower surface of the wing, and this was followed by removing the masks on the windscreens, which have done a fantastic job of producing neat and tidy results. The final step was to build up the vintage display stand, which I bought separately, and this was installed into the bottom of the aircraft. And with that, I'm going to call my build of the Airfix Vampire in 1/72 scale complete. And that's another build under the belt. So what do I think of this kit, having kind of revisited it almost a decade after I first experienced it? Well, back when I first built it, I remember thinking it was an exceptionally good kit, and definitely completely different to the Airfix kits that I built in my youth. It has some really nice modern features, such as the recessed panel lines, which are not as deep as some earlier offerings from Airfix. It has included crew figures and the option to display the landing gear raised or lowered. As mentioned though, sadly no display stand is included, but it could be modified to include one if you have something lying around that you could use. The included kit decals that I used were pretty good, perhaps a little thin, and could be folded over during application, which is definitely how I ruined one of them in my original build nearly 10 years ago. But having avoided that problem in this build, the kit transfers went on okay. The aftermarket decals that I used were pretty good too, and I didn't experience any problems with the application of those. They are a little bit pricey though, but you do get a good selection of different schemes included in your decal sheet. So I could perhaps in the future get another version of this kit to try and replicate one of the other paint schemes as well. Perhaps areas of this kit which are a little bit showing their age are in that gap on the lower wing root, which I didn't bother to address. Additionally, some of the seams I could have paid a bit more attention to and tidied them up a little bit more. Generally though, the fit of the parts is quite good. I was also surprised by the low amount of flash that this kit features, despite the fact that it has been in a number of production runs. One of the main problems this kit had though was that excessive amount of release agent, which was present on the sprues, and I had to wash it off. I don't think I've ever experienced a kit with that much oily residue on it before. Fortunately though, the wash was sufficient to remove it. As I look through the kit as well, there are a few little scuffs and things which must be artifacts from the tooling, given that this has had so much use out of it. One of the great things about this kit though is the price. Now typically a starter set version of this kit would retail for about £12 here in the UK, but it's unlikely that you would be able to find a starter set version of this kit. Whilst it's true that I did build the starter set version of this kit back in 2016, technically this would now be considered a gift set, with Airfix having redesigned their starter set ranges to be something simpler and easier to build. This kit has seen a number of different releases since its original tooling back in 2013, some of them as gift sets or starter sets, and some as single releases with different paint schemes. The production of this particular kit that I have here is from 2024, when it was on sale at a discount supermarket here in the UK for only £6.99. So at that price, a model kit of this quality, and bearing in mind it also came with additionals such as paint and glue and a brush, which I didn't bother to use, that is exceptional value. Especially given the fact that I did it in my own custom paint scheme, which means that getting aftermarket sets and having a whole fleet of vampires is definitely within most modelers' budgets. Quick mention about the CT scale model mask set that I received for review. I found this to be very effective, easy to apply, and I can't really find any negatives with it. Definitely products that I would consider using again in the future. As far as my finished kit goes, I'm pretty happy with the results, and I enjoy having it in a flying pose. It is nice to have a slightly different looking vampire as opposed to the all silver variant I built previously. The bright green and bright white of this particular paint scheme indicates that this is a Sea Vampire T.22. It is my understanding that the Vampire T.11 and the Sea Vampire T.22 are effectively the same aircraft, with the only differences being internally. So externally there were no modifications I had to make. But yeah, I think it's probably time to wrap this one up. This kit is just as good as I remember it from the first time that I built it 10 years ago. It was nice to explore it again and build it in a slightly different paint scheme. Given that this may be available again in the future at such a cheap price, I definitely could consider getting another one and building up one of the other paint schemes included in that Xtradecals sheet set that I have. And with that, I'm going to leave this one here. Let me know down in the comments what you think of my build and my assessment of this kit, and feel free to drop any suggestions for other topics you'd like to see in the future. As always, a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them, check out the links in the description. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our latest member to the club, Richard. Thanks for joining us. There are other ways to help support the channel as well, and full information is below the video. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.